Hello everyone. My name is Angel Flores, and I will be presenting my research paper, which has to do with Spanish instruction in dual language programs. Mhm. So, the question that was addressed through my paper is what challenges are present in dual language programs that prevent effective Spanish instruction and linguistic transfer? So, many program designs in dual language education really tend to give a space for Spanish instruction. But as years progress, students don't develop that biliteracy as expected. And so my goal is to see here, okay, what challenges are present in educational contexts that hinder that effective Spanish instruction, that development of the mother tongue, the home language, and therefore linguistic transfer that allows that biliteracy to happen. And so through the literature review, I was able to see and to learn learn about some of the challenges that take place in educational context. So that's the question. For the theoretical framework, I relied on the biliteracy squared approach by Escamilla, presented in 2014. This model of biliteracy has been designed to accelerate the development of biliteracy in Spanish English speaking children. And so basically, what this model intends to do is to provide a framework that allows supervisors and teachers to implement appropriate practice with the goal of developing biliteracy. And so this framework really doesn't approve the idea of the two monolinguals in one. Um, but rather supports the idea that a whole linguistic repertoire is used within a context to communicate. And so it doesn't separate abilities like you use English separately and then Spanish separately, but really supports that idea that there is linguistic transfer. There is a common underlying proficiency, like the one presented by Cummins. And so these two frameworks really go together because they basically approve the idea that linguistic skills that are learned in one language can be easily transferred to another. Of course, all this is relied upon factors such as development of languages through time, the educational program the student is in, and the overall use of languages. But overall, the framework that we're using here is that, okay, Spanish and English need to be used. There needs to be a space where linguistic transfer happens because there is a common underlying proficiency that allows a child to use their whole linguistic repertoire to communicate and to be part of linguistic tasks. And so for that to happen, there is a need of authentic Spanish instruction, which sometimes does not happen within the educational dual language context. And so that was the purpose of this paper. Now, literature review themes. There were 4 literature review themes that we were able to identify through the literature review. And the first one is authentic Spanish instruction. So it needs to take place intentionally, it needs to be developed, it needs to be welcomed, right? With no interference by English language, right? So if we are able to develop that Spanish, which is the home language, it's going to put us in a huge advantage when it comes to biliteracy because we're giving out the message Spanish is important and it's going to help you to learn English. And so, through the use of authentic Spanish instruction, we will have increased meta language, which is opportunities for connections between languages. And of course, the instruction needs to be in oracy, reading, writing, and meta language within its allotted time in the instructional day. And so that is needed uh, for biliteracy to develop. And so basically, I confirmed the need of Spanish instruction through the literature. Now, what are potential challenges? Well, a challenge is the monolinguistic view and the hegemony of English that basically does not see biliteracy or bilingualism as an asset And so it puts as English as the norm, English as the language of power, not bilingualism. And so what this results in an idea that we need to push for English, right? And even a study that was part of the review said students tend to use more English. Why? Because that's the language that's promoted within the educational space. It's the language that's used for announcements, for meetings, the languages teachers use when they communicate with other teachers. And so since English dominates so much, and ideas such as, oh, it's the United States, it's all about English. So things like this really, really hinder Spanish development, because what happens is that, okay, we don't have to put that much of effort into Spanish because English is the norm. We want to make sure that you transition to English as fast as possible. And so, of course, all these decisions of language use really have to do with administrators and supervisors and overall the program design. But the overall attitude of English is the norm, English is first, English has more value, really, really places Spanish instruction at a huge disadvantage, because bilingualism is not seen as an asset. It's seen as a way, language learning, to tackle remediation. And so one of the things that I was able to learn through the literature review is, okay, English dominates so much. And because of that, Spanish instruction is hindered. The next theme is assessment, the availability of assessments. There has been a lack, according to research, of assessments really evaluating what students know in both languages. Most teachers rely on federal mandates and high stakes testing for assessment. And so these tests, like the STAR test, they really push the English. They even have a higher standard of passing when it's in English. And so this overall promotes the idea of language as a problem. And teachers make decisions that limit the first language and prioritize English and dual language. So let's do more English. Okay, we already know that research says, oh, students will like English better. They're going to use English. But the teachers are promoting this because they change their practice to prioritize English, because it's all about accountability. The assessments that they use are all written in English. So they need to teach English more. And so that limits in Spanish instruction and overall biliteracy. Even a research study that was part of the literature review said that Spanish writing was not seen. It was not seen in the classroom. Even though Spanish was taught, they only saw English writing assessment. And so this puts teachers in the decision to do more English, but overall hinders that bilingualism and that Spanish instruction. We're not going to do Spanish instruction, a teacher might say, because I need to focus on the English. The test is in English. And so what Biliteracy Squared framework says is that we need to see assessment as an integrated whole, where the student has the opportunity to use everything they know about language and evaluate that and see student learning through assessments in both languages. But of course, accountability takes over, state mandates take over, and English, we want English, right? So that's another challenge, the assessment practices that we have. Now, for instructional practice, two themes were recurring through the literature review, which was language use and translanguaging pedagogy. So translanguaging pedagogy is a new idea of including an instructional space within the classroom where students can use their whole linguistic repertoire. And it really looks at language as a dynamic form. Like it's dynamic. Language use is dynamic, flexible. It can change. You can use what you know from one language in another to communicate a message. And so this overall pedagogy that has been increasing in research really validates bilingual students' identity. And so that could be a possible path forward for instructional programs that really have the goal of developing biliteracy, translanguaging, which is the strategic use of a student's whole linguistic repertoire. And of course, language use. How are we using language? Well, if it's Spanish instruction has um, proven to provide positive results, then we need to be able to use that the language competence the students have in a strategic way to transfer that to another language. So, how are we using language in the classroom? Are we teaching just because we need to for a test or because it's part of the curriculum? Or are we really being intentional with those language uses? And so that's overall the theme there. Language use it effectively for transfer and translanguaging, this pedagogy that really validates the use of a student's linguistic repertoire, whole linguistic repertoire, rather. So, for implications for teaching, there are four. So, one of the things that educational context and stakeholders need to do is elevate the status of the Spanish language. So, the context itself needs to be bilingual. Like they need to promote biliteracy, bilingualism, the educational context. Because if there's a classroom where there's a dual language group of students, but then outside it's all English, nothing's in Spanish, then what message are we sending? So the context needs to be conducive to biliteracy, and the status of the Spanish language needs to be taken into consideration. Use more Spanish. Try to do meetings in Spanish, announcements in Spanish, communicate with parents in Spanish, or conduct meetings that are only in Spanish, right? Elevate that Spanish use so that it does not look or be perceived as inferior as the English. We need to analyze instructional practice. What practices are we having in the classroom that are not helping in the development of bilingualism and biliteracy? Are we tending to do more English? What practices in the classroom are taking place that hinder Spanish instruction? Is it the curriculum? Is it the number of minutes that we um, put into each language area? The linguistic connections. What linguistic connections are we practicing in the classroom? Are we giving that space for students to apply what they know in one language and see it in another? Those cross linguistic connections. Are we doing that? That's important in order for bilingualism to happen. And of course, the evaluation of program design. What is the purpose? What is the time allocation? What resources are being used? What are the teacher attitudes for the program? How are they being prepared? All these implications for teaching are necessary in order for us to change our view, our practice, and ensure that biliteracy is being developed. And so Spanish needs to be seen something valuable first within the educational context. Then we need to see at practices. What practices do we have in the classroom that hinder the development of Spanish or the uh, Spanish instruction? And then the design of the program. How can we uh, change the design of our program to allow those linguistic connections to happen? And so that was more or less what the paper talked about: Spanish instruction and the potential challenges that are seen in educational contexts that prevent its development.